"She's not like other kids," the neighbor whispered. "After the accident that took her mother's life a year ago, she doesn't talk or walk. Would you be willing to try?" Elena hesitated. Although this wasn't the job she wanted, the rent, her mother's medical bills, and her brother's school books were still a heavy burden. She had no other choice. Elena Carter, a young woman of great willpower. At 25, she was the top nursing student at a community college in Brooklyn, with a dream of working in a hospital to care for patients. Her life seemed clearly mapped out, but a sudden tragedy tore all her plans apart. When her father died from a stroke, Elena's family was plunged into debt. Her mother was devastated, and her 17-year-old brother still needed to finish school. Putting aside her white coat and stethoscope, Elena took every job she could to support her family, from waiting tables and cleaning houses to mopping floors. That morning, New York wore a gray blanket. Elena took the one train up to the Upper West Side. In her worn cloth bag, she carried her homemade lunch, her resume, and a sliver of hope. At the same time, 33-year-old Ethan Blake was living in a world of privilege filled with pain. His glass and steel penthouse on the Upper West Side, with a view of Central Park, reflected a perfectly arranged life. As the CEO of a successful architectural firm, Ethan was known for his talent and arrogance. Money and power had turned him into a cold, cynical man, indifferent to those around him. But in his perfect world, there was a hidden corner named Sophie, his 4-year-old daughter. Since the accident that took his wife's life, Sophie had fallen into a strange, silent state. She didn't talk, didn't walk, and didn't react. Although she had been examined by the best specialists in New York and beyond, no one could find a specific cause. "It's psychological trauma," they said. "She needs time." But as time went on, the pain for both Ethan and Sophie only deepened. Anna's death had stolen the best part of Ethan. Once a warm, smiling man, Ethan was now just a machine, obsessed with control. In less than a year, he had fired 3 nannies. The last one, a child psychologist, was let go because she asked him to spend more time with his daughter. "I work to give her the best," he yelled. "Don't bring those meaningless emotions into my house." He refused to accept the truth that the problem wasn't Sophie. It was him. Only one person saw the situation clearly. Grace Blake, Ethan's mother. She was a strong, kind, and wise woman. Heartbroken to see her son lost in loneliness, she took matters into her own hands. On the recommendation of a manicurist, she contacted a young nursing student named Elena Carter, who had recently started taking babysitting jobs due to financial hardship. A brief interview and the sad yet vibrant look in Elena's eyes were enough to sway her. That morning, as Ethan was reading a project report, the intercom rang. "Son, she's here. Her name is Elena. Please be nice to her." Ethan hung up without a reply, his jaw clenched. Another nanny, another failure, was waiting. The private elevator door opened, and Grace stepped out with her usual warm smile. Beside her stood Elena, looking like a fragile butterfly about to be crushed. "Ethan, this is Elena. Elena, this is my son." Ethan's eyes scanned her from head to toe with contempt. Despite her timidness, Elena exuded a quiet strength that made him uneasy. Her eyes were like a deep well, filled with sorrow and weariness, yet they held a glimmer of hope that he couldn't comprehend. Her simple and genuine presence felt like a slap in the face to his perfect world. "Welcome," he muttered curtly. Sensing the tension, Grace spoke up. "Ethan, you go to your office. Elena, come with me. I'll give you a tour of the house, and of course, introduce you to little Sophie." Ethan stood up, didn't look back, and walked straight into his office, slamming the door shut. A chill ran down Elena's spine. What she had thought was an opportunity now felt like a nightmare. But catching Grace's encouraging gaze, she took a deep breath. She was here for her mother and her brother. She would not give up. The penthouse, with its modern furniture, expensive wall art, and spectacular city views, felt more like a lavish tomb than a home. There was no warmth, no life, just layers of opulence stacked on top of a profound emptiness. With a gentle gesture, Grace led Elena down a hallway to a quiet room. "She spends most of her time in here," she said softly. The room looked like every child's dream, with high-tech toys, giant stuffed animals, and a princess bed. But at the center of it all, a dark-haired girl with sad eyes was curled up in a corner, clutching an old stuffed rabbit, tiny, heartbroken, and alone. Her name was Sophie, and her silence echoed through the large room louder than any sound. Elena felt a lump in her throat. This child was a mirror reflecting her own pain, though it came from different wounds. Sophie was trapped in a golden cage, while Elena had fought her entire life just to survive. But in their hearts, both held a deep sorrow, an unspeakable loss. The door creaked open. Elena stepped inside and saw Sophie for the first time. The girl sat on the cream-colored rug, clutching an old teddy bear, her eyes staring unblinkingly out the window. Her shiny blonde hair was neatly brushed, and her gray eyes held a sadness so deep it seemed to silence the air around her. There were no sounds, no lullabies, no giggles, no musical toys, only silence. A thick, heavy, and painful silence. "Hello?" Elena whispered, crouching a few feet away. There was no reaction. Elena slowly placed her hand on the rug, feeling the softness beneath her fingertips. She took a picture book from her bag. "I brought a story. Would you like to look at it?" Still, no answer. Sophie remained glued to the world outside the window, as if everything real, everything safe, was somewhere out there, where there was no pain, no memories. Ethan stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, like a statue guarding a kingdom of silence. He said quietly, "She hasn't spoken for a year since her mother's accident. It's like she's just gone. All you have to do is make sure she doesn't hurt herself. That's it." "She needs more than that," Elena replied, her voice as soft as a breath. Ethan gave her a cautious look. "Miss Carter, don't think you can save anyone here. This isn't a soap opera." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Elena in the quiet room with the silent child and a storm of emotions she couldn't yet name. Elena didn't know whether to cry or laugh. But then she looked at Sophie and recognized that look. It was the look she had seen in the mirror after her father passed away. The look her mother had worn when she no longer wanted to eat. The look her brother had tried to hide when he thought no one was watching. Elena realized that the silence was not an empty space. It was a cry for help that no one was listening to. The first few days passed in heavy, suffocating silence. The sound of Elena's footsteps echoed through the vast penthouse, often the only sound to be heard. Ethan continued his life like clockwork, morning workouts, endless meetings, and non-stop emails. Her presence in his house was like that of a ghost. He saw her, but didn't truly look. He spoke to her, but never had a conversation. Their relationship was cold and distant, defined by boundaries he would never let her cross. Ethan Blake, a man who prided himself on being the sole provider for his family, completely ignored his nanny's existence. The indifference brought Elena a strange mix of both relief and anxiety. Their interactions were short and tense, consisting of little more than sharp nods and brief glances. One morning in the kitchen, Elena was making fresh strawberry juice for Sophie. She wore a simple apron, her face calm and focused, bathed in the warm sunlight pouring through the window. Ethan rushed down the stairs, his tie askew. He stopped, and for a brief moment, he saw her. Something in that moment stunned him. It looked normal, intimate, like a family. Something he once had and had lost. He quickly turned away, his frown deepening. "What are you doing?" he barked. "Strawberry juice for Sophie. It's her favorite," Elena replied without looking up. "Don't give her strawberries. She's allergic," he yelled. "But Mrs. Grace told me." Elena began to explain. "My mother doesn't know everything," he interrupted. "Make orange juice instead." Stunned, Elena heard him walk away, apple in hand, without another word. Tears welled up in her eyes. Grace had confirmed that Sophie was not allergic to strawberries. It was something Sophie's late mother, Anna, had once told her. Ethan wasn't protecting his daughter. He was simply lashing out at the only person he still felt he could control. Despite this, she still made the orange juice, but the bitter taste of humiliation stayed with her all day. Yet, Elena continued to quietly build a bridge with Sophie. The little girl, who had always sat silently in a corner, now began to look at her with curious eyes. Elena never forced her. She would simply be there, singing soothing lullabies, reading stories in a gentle voice, and most importantly, touching her. Her light, nurturing touch became the only language Sophie accepted. Then, on a rainy day when the New York sky was gray and rain poured down the penthouse windows, Elena refused to let the weather dictate her mood. After lunch, she sat on the floor as usual, spreading a thin blanket in the middle of the room. She placed a few stuffed animals on it, including a familiar one from the old bag she always carried. "We're going to have a little concert today," she whispered, her voice as soft as the rain. Sophie sat in her usual spot, hugging her teddy bear, her eyes glued to the window. Elena didn't mind. She picked up a tiny hand puppet and, in a cheerful and mischievous voice, said, "Hello, I'm Mr. Dinosaur. Anyone who gets in my way is going to be a-chew." She pretended to sneeze so hard that she fell backward, her legs kicking wildly in the air like an overturned bug. It was hilarious, absurd, and it worked. A small laugh, light as a breeze, escaped from Sophie's lips. Elena quickly sat up. Sophie covered her mouth, as if she couldn't believe the sound had come from her. Her gray eyes widened in surprise, and then she giggled again, a little louder this time, still soft, but real. Elena didn't say a word. She just smiled, continuing the puppet show, determined to make Sophie laugh again. At that same moment, Ethan, working in his office, heard a sound through the crack in the door. He stood up, confused, unsure if he had imagined it. He walked out, following the delicate sound, the sound of laughter he hadn't heard in a year, and in that room, he saw it. Elena was lying on the floor with her legs in the air, performing a silly dinosaur routine. And Sophie, his daughter, was leaning over her, her eyes sparkling, her lips curled up, and her shoulders shaking with soft giggles. Ethan was stunned. The sight was simple and peaceful, but to him, it felt like a punch to the chest. It had been so long since he'd seen her like that. His eyes were filled with a bitter mix of happiness and guilt. He didn't go in. He quietly stepped back, closing the door without a sound. Returning to his desk, he stared at the unfinished architectural drawings. But they no longer held any meaning. Only that laughter echoed in his mind. A sound once commonplace, now more precious than anything he had ever built. The next morning, the first sunbeams after the rainy days pierced through the large windows, casting golden streaks on the shiny hardwood floors. The penthouse seemed brighter, but the air was still heavy and tense. Elena was in the playroom with Sophie. Recently, the little girl had begun to show small signs of awareness, glancing at Elena during story time and occasionally twitching her lips as if to respond. They were small steps, but full of hope. Today, Elena decided to try something different. From her bag, she pulled out a large therapy ball, a tool she had kept since she was a nursing student. She knew the process. Have the child sit on the ball, gently hold them, and move slowly to activate their core muscles and balance. At first, Sophie was a little nervous, but Elena was patient. "It's just a game," she whispered. "It's like sitting on the moon." Bathed in the morning light, Sophie sat on top of the ball, clutching her teddy bear, gently swaying to Elena's instructions. Her tiny legs began to move, and her back straightened slightly. Then the door opened. Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes wide, his face flushed with anger. He saw his daughter on a large therapy ball, clutching the teddy bear, while Elena supported her from behind. "What the hell are you doing?" he roared, his voice exploding with rage. Elena froze. Sophie immediately recoiled, hugging her teddy bear tighter. The ball stopped. The room fell silent. "This is a basic therapeutic technique," Elena said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I learned it in school. It helps Sophie." "You're a nanny, not a physical therapist," Ethan yelled, storming into the room. "I've hired the best professionals. Who do you think you are to do what they couldn't?" Elena took a step back, a look of dismay on her face. She took a deep breath. "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm just trying to help. She needs to move. She's making progress." "Nobody asked you to do that," Ethan said coldly. "Don't put my daughter at risk again." He walked forward, lifted Sophie off the ball. The little girl trembled, clinging to his shoulders, burying her face in his neck. Elena watched, her chest tightening painfully. Ethan left the room without another word. Suddenly, the space felt empty, as if all the air had been sucked out. Elena stood still, her hands on the soft ball. Once a symbol of hope, it was now the cause of a storm. A tear fell. Then another. She wasn't crying because he had yelled at her. She was crying because a door of hope had just been slammed shut the moment it opened. Ethan carried his daughter upstairs, gently placed her in her crib, and hummed a lullaby that Anna used to sing. But his heart was in turmoil. The image of Elena, strong, steady, and full of hope, made him uneasy. It wasn't because she still had hope, but because he didn't. He felt like a failure, a helpless father. Anna's death hadn't just taken his wife. It had also robbed him of his faith in his dreams, his direction. And now, Elena, with her quiet strength and determined will, was like a mirror reflecting all the flaws he had tried so hard to bury. He sat by Sophie's bed, watching her sleep. Her small face, long eyelashes, and soft pink cheeks reminded him that life, despite the pain, was always beautiful. He stood up, picked up his phone, and called his assistant. "Cancel everything this afternoon," he said. He needed space to think, to fix what he had broken. He walked downstairs. In the kitchen, Elena stood at the sink, her back to him. Her shoulders were slightly slumped, and her eyes, though she tried to hide it, were still red from crying. He slowly approached, feeling awkward and ashamed. "Elena," he said, his voice hoarse. She flinched, quickly wiping away her tears as she turned around. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, almost a whisper. "I didn't mean to speak to you that way. It's just, I'm scared." Those simple, sincere words hit her like a bomb. For the first time, she saw beyond his cold exterior. A father who had lost everything. A widower drowning in sorrow. His eyes were no longer cold, they held real pain. "I understand, Mr. Blake," she said quietly. "I just want to help." He bowed his head. "I know, and I was wrong. I need your help. I need you to help me save my daughter." He held out his hand, an act of surrender from a man who had spent his life in control of everything. It was a true moment of courage. Elena didn't hesitate. She reached out and took his hand. There, in the middle of the kitchen, between the unfinished dishes and their unspoken pain, a reconciliation blossomed, and with it, a glimmer of hope, a fragile flower quietly blooming on hard ground. From that day on, everything in the penthouse slowly began to change. Not overnight, no miracle made Ethan the perfect father, but little by little, the coldness began to melt away. He started coming home earlier, at first for a few minutes, then for hours. He no longer locked himself in his office all day. Instead, he would walk into the playroom, quietly watching Elena read stories and smiling whenever Sophie pursed her lips to hold back a laugh. One evening, as Elena and Sophie built a castle out of wooden blocks, he sat down beside them, shyly picking up a piece of wood. "Where does this go?" he asked softly. Elena's eyes widened in surprise, but she kept a calm expression. She pointed. "It goes on the left." It was a castle tower. Ethan fumbled with the pieces. Wrong, second try, still wrong. On the third attempt, the block slipped and knocked down half the castle. He looked at Elena with wide eyes, then at Sophie, and then his daughter let out a loud, clear laugh. For the first time, Ethan laughed too. From then on, he started asking Elena more questions. "How was Sophie today? What's her favorite food? Elena, do you like to draw?" His questions were clumsy, but sincere. Elena sometimes answered briefly, and sometimes she talked about her mother and brother, about the late nights in their tiny Brooklyn apartment, where survival meant sharing everything. One evening, when the three of them sat down to dinner together, no longer with Ethan eating alone in his office, he quietly asked, "Is your family okay?" Elena looked up. It was a simple question, but coming from Ethan, it meant a lot. She nodded. "They are. My mom is doing better now. My brother is about to graduate from high school." Ethan looked at her, his eyes distant. "You're so strong. I've never met anyone like you." Elena offered a slight smile, but something warm blossomed in her heart, not from the compliment itself, but from the way he spoke, not as a boss, but as a man learning to connect. After dinner, as part of their new routine, they put Sophie to bed together. Elena read a story. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, occasionally interjecting silly comments that made Sophie giggle. When Sophie was asleep, they didn't rush out. They sat in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Elena looked around the room, which had once been a castle of silence, now filled with light, laughter, and hope. She turned to Ethan. "You know," she said quietly, "she's not just relearning how to walk. She's relearning how to live." Ethan nodded, his eyes welling up. "Me too." That weekend, a big storm hit. The New York sky turned nearly black, and rain poured down. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Flashes of lightning lit up the windows. It was as if nature itself was reflecting the lingering pain in the Blake family. The three of them huddled together in the dimly lit living room. The smell of damp earth, the steady rhythm of the rain, and the distant rumble of thunder created an atmosphere that was both melancholic and strangely intimate. Sophie trembled with fear, burying herself in Elena's arms. Ethan, noticing his daughter's distress, sat down next to them. He reached out and gently took Elena's hand, a small, comforting gesture, and for the first time, he began to talk about Anna, his late wife. "She was the most wonderful woman I've ever known," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "She was so full of life. She had so many dreams. She was the light of my world." Elena didn't say anything. She just listened, her eyes full of empathy. She understood. He needed to say these words. He needed to free himself from the burden of grief and guilt that had been silently weighing on him for so long. Ethan talked about the accident, the guilt, the nightmare of losing the woman he loved. "I used to be so arrogant," he admitted. "I thought money could fix everything. But then I lost her, and I almost lost my daughter. I became a different person, Elena. A monster, a man I didn't even recognize." Elena leaned over and wrapped her arms around him. It was a simple but sincere hug, a hug that only someone who truly understood his pain could give. "You're not a monster, Ethan," she whispered. "You're a father who got lost, but you're trying to find your way back, and that's what matters." Ethan held her tight, and then the tears came, the tears he had held back for far too long. They fell silently like the rain seeping into the roof above them. The storm passed, and the pain, if only for a little while, began to subside. Ethan and Elena, now closer than ever, sat quietly with Sophie nestled between them. The fragile connection that began with loss and obligation was slowly becoming something bigger, deeper, and more real. That afternoon, Central Park was bathed in a soft, golden sunlight. The leaves had begun to change color, rustling in the wind like the whispers of old stories. Elena and Ethan sat on a bench while Sophie lay on a thin blanket, playing with her familiar teddy bear, her eyes watching the kites dancing in the distance. Ethan sighed, his gaze on his daughter. "My little girl," he murmured. "She's like a puzzle piece that's slowly being put back together." Elena was silent for a moment, then asked softly, "Have you ever thought about finding another specialist for Sophie? A new method?" Ethan turned to look at her, his brows slightly furrowed. "We've seen the best in New York. We've tried everything, but nothing has changed." "But what if the problem isn't her physical body being stuck?" Elena said gently. "What if it's her heart, her spirit? I read about a pediatric therapist in Seattle. He combines physical therapy with music, animals, and emotional support. He's had real results with children who have been through trauma." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with both hope and fear. "What if we fail again?" "But what if we don't?" Elena said, taking his hand. "What if this gives Sophie the chance to run and jump, to have the childhood she deserves?" He gently squeezed her hand. Something in Elena's voice sparked a glimmer of light in his chest. "Let's go," Ethan said after a moment of silence. "Seattle, right?" Elena nodded. And 1 week later, the three of them boarded a plane heading west, not with certainty, but with a fragile yet fierce hope. In Seattle, on a foggy morning, they arrived at a small clinic nestled under towering pine trees. Dr. Jonathan Rivera greeted them with a gentle smile and a warm handshake. After an initial conversation, he knelt down to Sophie's level, held out his hand, not forcing it, just waiting. Sophie looked at him, and for the first time with a stranger, she didn't shy away. After his examination, the doctor concluded that she didn't need to be corrected. She needed to be heard. He confirmed there was no neurological or mechanical damage. Everything was a defensive reaction to a deep wound, a fear so intense it had frozen her body. Elena teared up. Ethan said nothing, but nodded. "We can fix this, Doctor," Rivera said. "It won't be fast, but it is possible." Ethan looked at Sophie, then at Elena, the woman who had lit the first candle in the darkness he and his daughter had been living in. And for the first time in over a year, he believed that hope was real. Seattle awoke in a haze of fog each morning, but for them, every day was bright. That small therapy center, with its soothing guitar melodies, bird songs from the distant forest, and a golden retriever named Maple trained to be with children, had quietly become Sophie's second home. In the mornings, Ethan made coffee while Elena braided Sophie's hair into two little pigtails. They didn't say much, but their eyes exchanged glances, witnessing something sacred growing between them. Sophie said nothing, but she began to hum softly along with the therapeutic songs. She couldn't walk, but she could crawl, sit up on her own, and reach for her toys. Each small movement made Elena blink back tears, while Ethan couldn't hide the silly, proud smile that was always on his face. On a sunny day, Dr. Rivera invited them to a nearby park for Sophie's first outdoor therapy session. Elena spread a blanket, Ethan set up a small tent, and Sophie sat between them on the grass, hugging her teddy bear, her eyes sparkling in the afternoon sun. "Let's try something new," Elena whispered, gently taking Sophie's tiny hands. Sophie looked at her, unafraid, just waiting. Elena carefully helped her stand. Sophie's legs trembled, and her back was slightly hunched, but she stood up, truly standing on her own feet in a moment as fragile as a sunset. And then, one wobbly, tiny step, seemingly infinite, was enough to freeze the air around them, silencing the entire world. Elena gasped. Ethan froze. Sophie looked at them both and gave a radiant smile. One more step. Then she fell into Elena's arms, giggling, and sound that had been lost to grief. Ethan couldn't hold back his tears. He knelt down and wrapped both mother and daughter in a tight embrace. Elena cried too, not because Sophie had walked, but because she had chosen to walk toward them. In that embrace, amidst the green grass, the warm sunlight, and the smell of the earth, they were no longer three broken individuals. They were a family. They returned to New York's on a gentle autumn afternoon. The penthouse was no longer cold or distant. The place that had once been a tomb of memory was now revived. On the table were Sophie's messy drawings. Stuffed toys were scattered on the floor, witnesses to a child who was finally alive. Elena walked into the kitchen, where there was now always the faint smell of toast and the gentle chatter of the morning radio. Ethan knelt by the window, planting herbs, a task he once considered a waste of time. Sophie, her legs still shaky but growing stronger every day, meandered through the living room, calling out loudly, "Elena!" Not loud, but clear. Each day was a miracle. One afternoon, the three of them sat on the balcony, leaning against each other on a couch, watching the sunset. No one said a word, only the soft hum of Sophie, an old therapeutic tune, and the peaceful rhythm of their hearts beating in unison. "I did what no one else could," Ethan whispered, his eyes on the horizon. "I saved her. I saved you." Elena smiled, saying nothing. She didn't need those words. She felt them in every gentle touch, every glance, every wobbly step. The next day, Ethan took them to a special place, a small house in the suburbs with a white porch and a lavender garden. Ethan said, "I bought it because I want Sophie to have a real childhood, and because I want you to have a real home." Elena froze. Sophie ran around the garden, shouting, "Teddy! Teddy!" as if calling for her beloved stuffed toy. "And I also have to ask," Ethan said, then took a small velvet box from his pocket. "Simple and sincere. I'm not asking out of obligation. I'm asking for a chance. Will you marry me, Elena Carter? Be the mother of my daughter and my love for life." Elena didn't answer right away. She walked over to Sophie, knelt down, and wrapped her arms around the child who was giggling as she chased butterflies. Then she turned around, her eyes full of tears, but a smile on her face. "I've been doing all of that for a while now, Ethan Blake." She took his hand and nodded, and there, Amidst the lavender blossoms and the laughter of a child who was once silent, a promise was made. Not a perfect one, but one forged by people who were once broken but never gave up hope. Life moves in circles. Pain, hope, love, and healing follow each other like seasons. Their family, Ethan, Elena, and Sophie, is proof that fate can be cruel, but nothing is stronger than a heart that dares to hope and refuses to surrender. Their love story is like a ballad. It didn't start with passion, but with brokenness. It didn't continue with roses, but with tears. And it doesn't end with a happily ever after, but with a quiet choice to love each other every day in ordinary moments, in the smallest things. Because hope in its purest form is the only thing that can heal all wounds.